France's Prime Minister Manuel Valls returns home today after meeting Israeli and Palestinian leaders in the Middle East as the killing continues. Nearly 30 Israelis and 200 Palestinians have been killed since October. Miko Peled, grandson of the Zionist leader who signed Israel's Declaration of Independence and son of an Israeli general who invaded the West Bank, is the author of The General's Son, and he joins me now. Miko, thanks for coming on the show. Let's just begin with your youth, you growing up in a Zionist household.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, as the book's title suggests, the general's son. I was the son of an Israeli general in a country and in a society where the generals are the gods of the Olympus, particularly that generation of generals who were the young officers of 1948, and they handed us the land of Israel back, us the Jews. And then these same young officers remained and built the Israeli army, and then 1967 led it to the, even a greater victory, where the rest of the land of Israel was finally liberated.
Already there were concerns in your family, because you say early on that your mother refused to take another family's home, as she put it.
In 1948, she took a very interesting and a very courageous stance. As a very young woman and a young mother, she was offered, like many Israeli families, were offered Palestinian homes who were, the Palestinians were forced to leave. We're talking about neighborhoods in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, and she was offered one of these beautiful Arab homes that are still there. And she said, no, how can I possibly take the home of another mother? Now, she was born and raised in Jerusalem. She still lives there. She's going to be 90. And she still talks about it with the same passion, how horrible it was to kick these people out, force them into exile. And then she still says, how could I move into the home of another mother,
Well, you say it's courageous. I'm sure the Israeli government would say, no, she was reneging on her own birthright.
Well, exactly. She was presenting a moral dilemma where the Israeli narrative, the Zionist narrative, doesn't believe there was a dilemma, a moral dilemma, because the story is that the Arabs left, that we asked them to stay after 1948, and they all got up and left. So there really is no moral dilemma. And for me, this story was a problem, too, because I grew up learning in school and everywhere else that the Arabs left. And her story was telling us about a moral dilemma that I really had a very hard time reconciling. I had to actually work on the book and write it and think about it before I could reconcile this conflict between what she was saying and what I knew to be true, that we don't do things like this.
Even with the onslaught of conditioning and at the tragic death of your niece, you ended up telling Ehud Barak, who had come to give his condolences, that the reason for Palestinian violence was the Israeli occupation.
Yeah, it was this absurd reality, and we see this all the time, where people who are supposed to be on the right side of an issue pretend that they're not, so as to get more votes and get elected. So his premise was, well, we can't tell anyone that we're pro-peace because then I might not get elected, so we're going to pretend that we're not going to negotiate and we're not going to make peace. It's absurd. Everybody knows the reason there's a problem in Palestine is the Israeli occupation, is the Israeli brutality, and until politicians have the courage to say it, it's never going to change. And of course, Ehud Barak was a big disappointment. He was the shortest, the shortest term of any Israeli prime minister was his. But yeah, that's the reality. If we don't recognize it, the killing continues. And of course, the killing is Palestinians being killed by Israel mostly.
But what did fellow Israelis, fellow people that you've been to school with, college with, think that was your response to the killing of your niece by a martyr or suicide bomber, depending on the side you're on?
It wasn't only my response, it was my sister's response, it was her husband's response, that this is the price that you pay as a society for maintaining an occupation. When you're colonizers, when you're violent, when you oppress another people, you pay a price, and that is the price that you pay, and it's always innocents who are dying. And that was the stance, a very brave stance that my sister and her husband took, and I kind of followed their lead, I have to say. I was inspired by them. But that is the reality. Israelis pay the price because they are maintaining a brutal oppression and a brutal occupation of another people.
And Benjamin Netanyahu gave his condolences to your family. You were not impressed with him back then.
He and my sister have been friends for many years before that. And he called to ask if he could come because the prime minister always comes. And my sister,
when it's an important
event like that, when it's an event like that, when there's a death, when there's what they call a terrorism death. And he was told not to come, that he was not welcome in the house, so he didn't come.
Why?
Because he was the prime minister. He did nothing. As prime minister, he did nothing. When you're the prime minister of Israel, you have the ability to make peace. You have the ability to end the violence, and he chose not to. And as we know today, he's prime minister again. I don't know, this is his third term or something, and he's continuing the same policies.
Yeah, quick sidebar. What do you think of his new defense minister choice, Avigdor Lieberman?
Madness, absolute madness. I mean, on the one hand, it's impossible to imagine things being worse because it's not like the previous defense ministers were angels. But Avigdor Lieberman brings a level of bruteness, of brutality, and willingness to engage in violence that is even worse than what we've seen so far. So whether or not he'll be able to enact these policies and whether the agreement will actually be signed and finalized is yet to be seen, because there are other voices within Netanyahu's coalition that are opposing, for example, the death sentence. There is no death sentence in Israel. So of course they have extrajudicial killings, and that's how they kill Palestinian leaders. But he wants to add this other dimension, which is actually bringing back the death penalty. The biggest concern is that the vast majority...
By beheading. He said they should have their heads chopped off with an axe. He was talking about disloyal Arab citizens.
Well, once you kill people, I don't suppose it matters if you kill them one way or another. The main concern is that the vast majority of what they call the security prisoners in Israel, the Palestinian prisoners, is that the vast majority of them have never been charged with acts of violence. These are political prisoners. And so what he wants is to execute these prisoners. There's some 7,000 of them now. Many of them are minors. And he wants to start executing these. And that is a very serious concern because these are political prisoners. The vast majority of them have never been engaged in violence. And even the ones who have been engaged in violence, there is an argument there that resistance to an occupation is legitimate.
Well, we've invited the new ambassador, Israeli ambassador, on. He hasn't come on the show yet, but presumably there are others in Israeli society, widespread perhaps, who share Avigdor Lieberman's view? Oh,
absolutely. There's no question. And there's no question that the ambassador will justify not just that, but Israeli crimes up and down, the last 67 years, 68 years. I mean, they always justify them. I can probably tell you what he's going to say, and you can probably imagine what he's going to say. He's going to justify all of it as self-defense, which is what they always do, but it's complete nonsense. And the interesting thing in Israeli society is that there is no dissent to this nonsense. Even as Israel was bombing Gaza in 2014, the government enjoyed the best ratings they ever had. Netanyahu was in, prime minister's heaven. And now, too, there's very little dissent. The assumption is that anything that is Palestine, that is related to Palestine solidarity, anything that talks about the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, is all anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with us because we have done nothing wrong. That is the consensus.
Because we're told here, I mean, the state-mandated BBC refused even a appeal for the people of Gaza who were hit by Israeli jets. We're told it's the rocket fire coming from Gaza that necessitates the Israeli response.
Blaming the oppressed for resisting is nothing. There's nothing new. Israel invented nothing here. When the oppressed resist, we tell them they need to sit quietly and behave themselves because it's impolite. When the oppressor bombs the hell out of people and kills thousands and injures thousands more, then we let them get away with all these ridiculous claims of self-defense. There has never been a threat to Israel from Gaza. Gaza has close to 2 million people, the vast majority of whom are poor refugees. There's never been a tank or a warplane or indeed an army in Gaza. There is no threat, there never has been, and everybody knows that. Anybody who's informed knows that. The idea that somehow the Israeli massacre of people in Gaza, which is, by the way, nothing new. Israel has been massacring people in Gaza since the early 1950s when Israel created the Gaza Strip. There's never been a threat. It is an ongoing massacre. I think using the word genocide isn't too extreme here either. It has nothing to do with self-defense. It has to do with the desire to kill the people in Gaza, to destroy them, and then blame them for the violence because it's the easiest thing to do.
And just finally, what about the inquiries in the British Labour Party? David Cameron, of course, stands by Israel. These inquiries in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party against alleged anti-Semitism, what have you thought about it?
Well, I think it's nonsense. I mean, everybody knows that it's nonsense. They try to conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, again, because that's the only argument they have. But what I don't understand is why Labour is apologizing. Why would they apologize? There is no anti-Semitism. It is legitimate criticism of Israel. It is legitimate criticism of Zionism. It is a brutal apartheid regime that has been going on for nearly 7 decades. And criticizing is not anti-Semitism. Why would they apologize knowing as they do that it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism? That, I think, is the big question.